The old man could not find his wallet, and within 30 seconds a line of strangers had decided he was worthless. Nobody in that supermarket knew his name was Edward Larkin, and nobody knew that the quiet young cleaner mopping near the registers was about to change the rest of his life, along with her own. By the time the first snow of the season had melted off the parking lot, everything about both of their worlds would be unrecognizable. Before we go further, if stories about kindness finding its way back to good people mean something to you, hit subscribe and tap that like button so more of these reach you. This channel is called Winter Veil, and staying with us to the end means a lot. Winter has always felt to me like the season that forgives people quietly, covering over the hard edges of a bad year with something soft and white. I wrote this story thinking about how snow falls on the proud and the poor exactly the same way, without asking who deserves warmth first. I hope Amelia's story reminds you that decency never really goes unnoticed, even when it feels like it does. Amelia Doran had been awake since 5 that morning, and by the time she clocked in at Northgate Market, she had already reheated oatmeal for her mother, checked her blood pressure, and walked the 11 blocks to work because the bus fare had gone toward a prescription refill. She was 24. With auburn hair she kept tied back under a gray cap and hazel eyes that still managed to look soft even after a double shift. People who worked with her said she moved like she was trying not to take up space, quiet, efficient, always finishing her section before anyone asked her twice. Her mother, Ellen, had a heart condition that had worsened over the past year, and the medication alone ate through nearly a third of what Amelia brought home. Amelia had a business degree from a state college and an unfinished internship she never got to complete, but none of that mattered inside Northgate, where her job was to keep the tile floors clean and stay invisible while doing it. Store manager Gregory Cabot liked her precisely because she never complained, and he made sure she knew that compliance, not competence, was what kept her employed. That Tuesday morning arrived gray and heavy, the kind of Denver sky that promised snow before noon, and Amelia was wiping down the entrance mats when she noticed an elderly man struggling at the second checkout lane. He wore a plain wool coat, unremarkable shoes, and an expression of quiet panic as he patted down his pockets again and again. The cashier had already called for a manager, and a small crowd of impatient customers had begun to gather behind him, murmuring loud enough for him to hear every word. "I cannot find my wallet," the old man said, his voice steady but strained. "Please, just give me a moment. I know it's here somewhere." A woman near the back of the line said she didn't have all day to watch someone pretend to search for money he never had, and a man beside her muttered that people shouldn't walk into a store without checking their pockets first. Gregory Cabot arrived with his arms crossed and told the old man plainly that if he could not pay, he needed to step aside and let the next customer through. Amelia stood by the mats and watched the color drain from the old man's face as strangers speculated about him within earshot, one customer wondering aloud if he'd hoped somebody would simply take pity and pay for him. The old man kept apologizing, his hands trembling slightly as he searched the same jacket pocket for the third time, and something in the way people talked about him, as if he weren't standing right there, made Amelia's chest tighten with a familiar kind of anger. She had felt that exact humiliation before, the kind that comes from being poor in public. She left her cart of cleaning supplies against the wall and walked toward the register, ignoring Cabot's sharp look, and asked the cashier how much the bread and bottled water came to. The old man turned to her, startled, and told her she didn't need to do that he would sort it out, but Amelia had already pulled the last of her grocery money from her apron pocket and set it on the counter. Cabot told her to get back to her section immediately, that this wasn't her concern, but Amelia said evenly that nobody deserved to be humiliated over a forgotten wallet, and she paid the full amount without waiting for his permission. The old man thanked her, visibly shaken, and asked her name, and she told him simply that it was Amelia, nothing more, because she genuinely expected nothing in return. Cabot ordered her to his office the moment the old man left the store, snow beginning to fall lightly outside the windows, as if the sky itself had finally decided to join the tension building inside. Amelia followed him down the narrow hallway past the break room, aware that every second away from her cart was a second Cabot would use against her. Inside the office, Cabot didn't sit down, choosing instead to stand over his desk with his arms folded, and told Amelia that she had directly disobeyed him in front of customers and embarrassed Northgate's management. Amelia explained that the man was being mocked and humiliated by strangers while an employee did nothing to stop it, and that she had only spent her own money, not the store's. Cabot said that kindness was not written anywhere in her job description, and that if she wanted to play hero on company time, she could do it somewhere else, because as of that moment she was suspended without pay pending termination review. Amelia felt the floor tilt slightly beneath her, thinking of her mother's medication bottle sitting nearly empty on the kitchen counter, and asked him steadily to reconsider, telling him her mother was sick and that this job was the only thing keeping them afloat. Cabot told her she should have thought of that before disobeying a direct order in front of a full checkout line, and reminded her to turn in her badge and uniform vest before she left the building for good. On her way out, Amelia passed a stock clerk named Rosa who had worked beside her for 2 years and who grabbed her arm in the break room doorway, whispering that Cabot had no right to do this and that half the staff would say so if anyone bothered to ask them. Amelia squeezed her hand and told her not to risk her own job over it, that some fights weren't worth the people you dragged down with you. And Rosa hugged her quickly before Cabot's voice barked down the hallway for both of them to get moving. Amelia walked out through the sliding doors into a thin curtain of falling snow, the cold air stinging against her face as the reality of what had just happened settled over her like a second winter coat she never asked to wear. She didn't have enough left for the bus, so she walked the 11 blocks home through streets already dusted white, replaying the last 20 minutes over and over, wondering if she should have simply stayed quiet the way she always had. By the time she reached her apartment building, her sneakers were soaked through and her hands had gone numb. But the ache in her chest had nothing to do with the cold. She stood outside the door for a long moment, trying to decide how to explain to her mother that the money for her medicine was already gone, spent on a stranger's bread and water. The snow kept falling behind her, quiet and indifferent, settling onto her shoulders the way disappointment settles into a person who has already run out of places to put it. And for a moment, she simply let herself feel small before she turned the key. Ellen took one look at her daughter's face and knew something had gone terribly wrong, and Amelia finally broke down at the kitchen table, telling her everything in a rush of half-sentences and quiet tears. Ellen listened without interrupting, and when Amelia finished, expecting to be told she had made a foolish choice, her mother instead reached across the table and held her hand firmly. "You did the right thing," Ellen said, "even if it cost us everything. I would rather have a daughter who helps a stranger than one who learns to look away." Meanwhile, across town in a private hospital wing that Amelia would never have guessed existed for a man who shopped at Northgate, Edward Larkin sat in a leather chair while his personal physician checked his blood pressure after the stress of the incident. His son Sebastian arrived within the hour, having dropped everything the moment the hospital called, still in the tailored charcoal suit he'd worn to a morning board meeting, his dark hair damp from the snow outside. Sebastian was 32, broad-shouldered with sharp gray eyes that missed almost nothing, and the kind of restrained intensity that made people in boardrooms sit up straighter without knowing why. "Dad, what happened?" Sebastian asked, kneeling beside the chair. "Are you hurt? Why didn't anyone call me the moment this started?" Edward waved off his son's concern and told him he was fine, that the real story wasn't about his wallet or his blood pressure, but about a young woman who had defended him without knowing who he was. "She looked at me like an ordinary old man who'd forgotten his money," Edward said, his voice thick with something between disbelief and gratitude, "and she gave away what was clearly the last of what she had." Sebastian asked skeptically whether the woman had simply recognized his father's face from the business press, but Edward shook his head firmly, insisting she had shown no sign of it whatsoever, no hesitation, no calculation, only plain instinct. "She's probably hoping you'll reward her later," Sebastian said, more out of habit than real suspicion, and Edward's expression hardened in a way his son rarely saw. "That says more about the world you've learned to live in than it does about her," Edward answered, "and I want to know what happened to her after I left that store." Sebastian, still doubtful but unwilling to argue with his father in his current state, called his assistant Perry Faraday and asked him to discreetly find out everything he could about the cleaner who had paid for the bread and water at Northgate Market. Perry started at Northgate Market itself, speaking low with a stock clerk who remembered exactly which cleaner had stepped forward that morning and who mentioned, almost as an afterthought, that the young woman had been marched off the floor by her manager less than an hour later. A second employee, still bitter about how it had unfolded, told Perry that the whole store had watched the woman get fired for doing something most of them wished they'd had the nerve to do themselves. By the following morning, Perry returned with a folder that told a fuller story than either of them expected: a business administration degree earned 3 years earlier, an internship cut short by her mother's declining health, and now, as of yesterday afternoon, unemployment. She was suspended and then terminated the same day, Perry said, for interfering with a manager's direct order during a customer dispute. Edward listened in silence, his jaw tightening as Perry read through the details, and when his assistant finished, the old man said only one thing: that they would be visiting her home personally the next morning, and that no amount of money sent secretly through an intermediary would make up for what had been taken from her. Sebastian argued that a wire transfer would accomplish the same result without the complication of a personal visit, but Edward reminded him that she hadn't sent someone else to help him. She had come herself, in the cold, without hesitation. If we owe her anything, Edward said, we owe her that same respect. The next morning, snow had settled over the modest street where Amelia lived, softening the cracked sidewalks and sagging fences into something almost peaceful, and Amelia was startled by a knock at the door while she sat with her mother going through job listings on an old laptop. She opened the door to find Edward Larkin standing there in a heavy coat, his son beside him in a dark wool overcoat that made him look like he'd stepped out of a magazine, tall and sharp-jawed with snow catching in his dark hair. And for a moment Amelia simply stared, unable to place why the old man looked so familiar out of the supermarket context. I came to thank you properly, Edward said, and to apologize for what happened to you because of me. Amelia invited them inside despite Ellen's flustered attempt to tidy the small living room, and once they were seated, Edward introduced himself fully, explaining that he was the founder of Larkin Industries and that Sebastian, standing silent by the window, was the company's current chief executive. Amelia felt her stomach drop as the pieces clicked into place, and she told him honestly that she'd had no idea who he was, that she would have done the same thing for anyone treated that way. I know, Edward said gently, that's exactly why I'm here. Sebastian, who had said little since arriving, finally spoke, telling Amelia that they had learned about her education and her unfinished internship, and that Larkin Industries ran a management training program for promising graduates each year. I'd like to offer you a place in it, Sebastian said, watching her carefully, not as charity, but because the qualifications are already there. Amelia felt a flush of both hope and suspicion, and asked bluntly whether this was only happening because she'd paid for his father's groceries, to which Sebastian answered honestly that it was how they'd found her, but not why they were offering. Ellen squeezed her daughter's hand and told her, her voice thick, that she had prayed for an open door for months, and that maybe this was finally it. But Amelia still hesitated, telling Sebastian she didn't want anyone in that company assuming she'd bought her way in with a loaf of bread. You'll take the same entrance assessment as every other candidate, Sebastian said, and go through the same probation. If you fail, you'll be let go like anyone else. I'm not offering you a title, I'm offering you a chance. Amelia looked at her mother's tired but hopeful face, thought of the empty medicine bottle on the counter, and finally said she would take the assessment. Amelia passed the assessment 2 weeks later with a score that surprised even the evaluators, and orientation began the following Monday under gray skies that occasionally spit thin flurries against the tall windows of Larkin Tower downtown. She arrived 40 minutes early in a second-hand blazer she'd pressed twice the night before, standing alone in the marble lobby watching other trainees move with an ease she didn't yet feel, certain that everyone could tell she'd been mopping floors 2 weeks earlier. A woman at the front desk offered her coffee and a visitor badge, calling her Ms. Doran with a warmth that still felt unfamiliar, and Amelia had to remind herself in the elevator mirror that she belonged there just as much as anyone riding it beside her. She quickly discovered that her arrival had already become office gossip, whispered about in break rooms and hallways. The cleaner who charmed her way into the executive training program by helping an old man at a grocery store. A trainee named Dominic Stratton, who had spent 8 years climbing toward exactly the kind of opportunity Amelia had just walked into, made no effort to hide his contempt whenever their paths crossed. You bought bread for the CEO's father, Dominic said one afternoon in the break room, loudly enough for others to hear. That's all. and now you're sitting in meetings the rest of us worked years to get into." Amelia told him evenly that she'd passed the same assessment he had, and that if he had questions about her presence there, he could ask Sebastian directly instead of talking about her like she wasn't standing right in front of him. Word of the exchange reached Sebastian by the end of the day, and he addressed it publicly at the next team meeting, reminding everyone that character mattered as much as credentials, and that Amelia had earned her place the same way anyone else had. Dominic had spent 8 years at Larkin Industries, missing birthdays and working weekends for the promotion he believed was finally within reach, and watching a woman with 6 months of tenure rise faster than he had in nearly a decade left a bitterness in him that no public reprimand from Sebastian could touch. He told himself it wasn't personal, that he simply believed in earning things the hard way. But late at night, reviewing spreadsheets alone in his apartment, the resentment sat in his chest like something frozen that refused to thaw no matter how he reasoned with it. Over the following months, Amelia proved herself in ways that quieted most of the whispering, working longer hours than anyone expected, absorbing feedback without complaint, and asking questions that revealed she understood the company's operations from the ground level in a way most trainees never bothered to learn. Sebastian found himself finding reasons to stop by her desk more often than his schedule required, and Amelia noticed, though she told herself it meant nothing beyond a supervisor checking on a promising employee. Snow kept falling steadily through that first winter in the city, blanketing the plaza outside Larkin Tower most mornings, and Amelia began to think of it as something almost comforting rather than something to trudge through. When Larkin Industries announced a major affordable housing initiative for a struggling neighborhood on the city's east side, Sebastian surprised the entire executive floor by naming Amelia as project director, passing over Dominic and several other senior trainees with far more tenure. "With respect, sir," Dominic said in the meeting where the announcement was made, "I've been here for 8 years, and she's been here for 6 months. How does this make sense to anyone?" Sebastian answered calmly that Amelia understood the people the project was meant to serve in a way no spreadsheet could teach, and that Dominic would support her as finance lead whether he agreed with the decision or not. Amelia visited the housing site personally in the weeks that followed, walking through slush and half-frozen mud with residents who told her bluntly that they didn't want another company showing up with cameras, calling them poor, and building whatever looked good in a press release. "Treat us like partners," one older resident told her. "Ask us before deciding." And Amelia carried that request directly back into the boardroom, insisting on resident input sessions that cut into projected profit margins. "It will reduce conflict and delay far more than it reduces profit," she told the finance committee when they pushed back, and slowly, reluctantly, the committee agreed to her terms. In the middle of that same stretch of long nights, Ellen's heart condition flared badly enough one evening that Amelia had to call an ambulance, sitting beside the gurney in the freezing air while paramedics worked, terrified that the promotion and the project and everything else might mean nothing if she lost the one person who had believed in her from the very beginning. Ellen recovered after 2 nights in the hospital, and when Amelia finally slept in the chair beside her bed, her mother woke her gently and told her that she wasn't going anywhere yet, that she still needed to see how the rest of this story turned out. Dominic's resentment deepened as Amelia's success became harder to dismiss, and one cold February evening, he found himself at a bar near the office with Camille Ashwood, Sebastian's fiancée, listening to her voice similar frustrations about how much attention the CEO had been paying to his new project director. Camille was polished and sharp-featured, the kind of woman who had grown up assuming rooms would rearrange themselves around her, and she had noticed the way Sebastian's expression softened whenever Amelia's name came up in conversation. "She's not just an employee to him anymore," Camille said under her breath, and Dominic, seeing an opportunity, offered to help her find proof before either of them said another word about it. The night before Amelia's final presentation to the city's housing board, someone altered the financial projections in her presentation file, swapping in numbers that made the project appear far less sustainable than the figures she had actually verified with her team. Amelia noticed the discrepancy only when she stood in front of the board the next morning, snow falling steadily outside the tall conference room windows, and realized mid-sentence that the figures on the screen did not match what she had personally checked the week before. "Are you saying your presentation is incorrect?" one board member asked sharply, and Amelia, her pulse hammering, said she could not in good conscience continue presenting numbers she now believed were wrong. She asked the board for 48 hours to locate the correct files and determine what had happened, telling them plainly that if the company had made an error, she would take full responsibility for it publicly rather than let anyone else absorb the blame. One elderly board member, a woman named Patricia Winslow who had sat on the Larkin board for over 2 decades, watched Amelia carefully throughout the exchange and later told a colleague that in 20 years she had never seen anyone stop their own presentation because they suspected dishonesty rather than push forward hoping nobody would notice. That kind of instinct cannot be taught, Patricia said, and it's exactly why this company should keep her. Another commissioner, less patient, asked whether the entire housing proposal should simply be tabled until Larkin Industries could guarantee its own numbers were reliable. And for a moment the room went cold enough that Amelia could hear the radiator ticking against the window. She told them plainly that tabling the project would only punish the families already counting on moving in by spring, and that she would rather stand there and be questioned honestly than let a mistake, hers or anyone else's, cost them their homes. Amelia spent that night and the next combing through server logs with 2 members of her team, eventually tracing the altered file back to a login that had accessed her project folder at nearly midnight, 3 days before the presentation. When she brought the evidence to Sebastian's office, he sat in silence for a long moment before asking her directly whether she suspected Dominic, and Amelia admitted she did, though she had no interest in destroying anyone's career over speculation. Sebastian called Dominic in personally, and after nearly 20 minutes of denial, Dominic finally admitted that he had accessed the file, though he insisted he had only meant to expose her, not to alter numbers that could damage the company's credibility with the city. I told him to expose her, not to change the figures, Camille said later that same evening, standing in Sebastian's office with her arms crossed, her voice tight, with barely controlled anger at having been implicated at all. Sebastian looked at her for a long moment, something shifting visibly behind his eyes, and asked flatly whether she had known Dominic planned to sabotage a project that would put affordable homes into a neighborhood that badly needed them. Camille didn't answer immediately, and in that silence Sebastian seemed to see something about her he had never fully let himself look at before, a coldness dressed up in expensive tailoring. That girl walked into our lives because of a loaf of bread, Camille finally said, her voice rising. And since then your father praises her constantly. You hand her project after project. You defend her in every meeting. Do you really expect me to believe nothing is happening between you? Sebastian told her plainly that Amelia had earned every project she'd been given, and Camille's response, that Amelia would always just be a cleaner no matter how many titles the company gave her, landed in the room like something breaking. I did not know you felt that way about people, Sebastian said, his voice low, and I'm not sure I can spend my life with someone who measures a person's worth by where they started. You're choosing her, Camille said, her voice cracking somewhere between anger and disbelief, and Sebastian told her honestly that this had never really been about choosing Amelia, that even if Amelia had never existed, he could no longer marry someone who believed a person's worth depended on the size of their paycheck. You'll regret this, Camille warned him, and Sebastian answered evenly that he hoped. One day, she might understand why it had to happen this way. The engagement ended that night, snow gathering thick against the office windows as Camille left without another word, and Sebastian sat alone for a long time afterward, turning the ring box over in his hands before finally setting it down. Dominic was terminated the following week, and the company chose not to pursue legal action against him after Amelia herself asked Sebastian to show restraint, telling him that public destruction wouldn't undo what had already been fixed. It's better to lose people who were never truly with us than to keep pretending they were, Sebastian told the board when the matter was formally closed. With the sabotage exposed and the housing board reassured by Amelia's transparency, the project moved forward, and the city's housing commission approved full funding 2 weeks later, citing her honesty during the original presentation as a deciding factor in their trust of the company. Buildings can be replaced, one commissioner told reporters afterward, but trust cannot. And this is the first developer we've worked with who stopped a presentation because the numbers felt wrong rather than pushing forward regardless. Amelia read the quote later that night at her mother's kitchen table, and for the first time in months allowed herself to believe that things might actually be turning out well. Word around the office soon turned from suspicion to something closer to reluctant respect, though not everyone had softened. And Amelia overheard enough comments in break rooms to know that some colleagues still whispered about how she had entered the company in the first place. She tried not to let it bother her, focusing instead on the site visits, the resident meetings, and the late nights reviewing construction timelines with her small team. But the loneliness of being watched constantly, judged for things she hadn't done, still wore on her more than she admitted to anyone. Her mother noticed the exhaustion in her voice during their phone calls and reminded her gently to breathe, that success built on honest work didn't need to prove itself twice. Sebastian found her alone in the office one evening in late winter, long after most of the floor had emptied out, his tie loosened and his dark hair slightly disheveled from a long day. Snow falling steadily past the windows in fat, unhurried flakes that caught the streetlights below. Amelia looked up from her desk, tired but still striking in the lamplight, her auburn hair loose around her shoulders for once instead of pinned back the way she wore it during the day. He told her he wanted to speak about something personal, and Amelia, bracing herself for another corporate complication, was surprised when he said simply that he admired her, not only her work, but who she was underneath it. "I've never seen you as someone I rescued," he said, when she reminded him that he had opened the door for her. "You walked through every other one yourself, and I admired you before you had a title or an office to go with it." Amelia felt something in her chest tighten in a way that had nothing to do with grief for once, but she pulled back instinctively, telling him that his engagement had just ended partly because of the perception around her, and that she refused to become the story people told about a CEO who fell for a woman he'd once called a project. "Your achievements belong to you whether you accept how I feel or not," Sebastian said, his voice steady, "and I'm not asking you to answer tonight, only to know that it's true." Amelia told him she needed time, and Sebastian, to his credit, didn't press her further, simply nodding and letting her leave the office alone into the falling snow outside. She spent the following weeks turning it over in her mind while she finished the final phase of the housing project, watching families move into homes that had existed only as blueprints 6 months earlier, children racing across freshly poured sidewalks still dusted with a light layer of snow. She thought about Camille's accusation, about the whispers in the break room, about how easily people could reduce a woman's entire worth to the man who had once opened a door for her, and she wondered whether accepting Sebastian would confirm every unfair assumption already circling her. But she also thought about the quiet steadiness in his voice that evening, and how nothing about it had felt like charity or convenience. She brought it up finally with her mother one evening while helping her set the table, admitting that she was afraid, not of Sebastian, but of what it might mean to lose herself inside someone else's much larger world. Ellen told her that fear before something good wasn't a sign to run from it, only a sign that it mattered, and that a woman who had walked 11 blocks home in the snow rather than beg for a favor was not the kind of person who could ever disappear inside anyone else's life. "You built this," Ellen said, holding her daughter's hands across the table. "Nobody can take credit for that but you." Then, in a smaller voice, her mother admitted her own fear, that a world of boardrooms and towers might slowly pull Amelia away from the small kitchen table where they'd survived so much together, and Amelia promised her that no title or address would ever change whose daughter she was. Ellen laughed through sudden tears and told her she was being dramatic, that she only wanted grandchildren someday who knew how to make her recipe for cornbread, and Amelia laughed too, grateful for a moment of lightness after so many heavy ones. Amelia found Sebastian on the top floor terrace a few days later, where he sometimes went to think, standing with his coat collar turned up against the wind while the city spread out below him under a fresh layer of white. She told him she had thought about everything he'd said, and that she was willing to try, not because she'd stopped being afraid, but because being afraid of something good felt like exactly the kind of fear worth ignoring for once. "Is that a yes?" Sebastian asked, and Amelia, smiling for what felt like the first time in months, told him it was a beginning, and that beginnings deserved to happen slowly and honestly rather than all at once. He nodded, seeming to understand exactly what she meant without needing it explained further, and for a while they simply stood together at the railing, watching snow drift down over the lit windows of the city below without either of them feeling the need to fill the silence with anything more. It was Amelia who finally spoke again, telling him plainly that she needed him to understand she would never soften herself into someone easier to introduce at company dinners, that she would always ask hard questions and defend people the company would rather forget. Sebastian told her that was the exact reason he was standing there in the cold in the first place. And something about the plainness of his answer settled the last of the doubt she'd been carrying since Camille's accusations. Edward heard about the two of them from Perry before Sebastian ever worked up the nerve to tell him directly. And when his son finally sat across from him, expecting some lecture about optics or shareholder perception, Edward only laughed, a real laugh, the kind Sebastian hadn't heard from him in years. "I told you there was more to that story than bread," Edward said, shaking his head. "That young woman saved my life twice. Once on the pavement, and once by teaching this whole family what we'd forgotten about kindness." Spring arrived eventually, though Denver held on to its snow longer than most cities, and by the time the housing project held its ribbon-cutting ceremony, Amelia stood beside Sebastian in front of families moving into their new homes, her mother watching proudly from the small crowd gathered near the entrance. Patricia Winslow approached Amelia afterward and told her the board had unanimously agreed to create a new division focused on community development, and that her name had received the highest recommendation of anyone considered to lead it. "I'm not sure I'm ready," Amelia said honestly, and Patricia only smiled and told her that nobody who deserved that kind of responsibility ever felt fully ready for it. A year later, Larkin Industries announced Amelia as its new director of community development, and the promotion made local news not for its novelty, but for the story behind it. A former cleaner who had once been fired for buying bread for a stranger, now overseeing housing projects across 3 neighborhoods. On the morning the announcement went public, snow fell lightly over the city one final time before the season turned, and Amelia stood at the same supermarket entrance where everything had started, watching a young woman near the registers struggling to find her employee badge for a manager who looked impatient already. Amelia walked over and introduced herself, learning the young woman's name was Tessa, 20 years old, working nights to pay for evening accounting classes while her manager hovered nearby with visible irritation. "Do you like the work?" Amelia asked her gently, and Tessa admitted honestly that it paid her tuition but little else, and that some days she wondered if anyone above her actually noticed the people doing this kind of job at all. "5 years ago, I was cleaning floors exactly like this," Amelia told her, sliding a business card across the counter. "And Larkin Industries has an education assistance program for people exactly like you. Apply, and let someone open a door for you the way one was once opened for me." Tessa turned the card over in her hands as if it might disappear, and asked softly why a stranger would bother helping her at all, and Amelia only smiled and told her that someone had once asked her the very same question, and that the answer hadn't changed since. That evening, Amelia told Sebastian about the encounter over dinner at her mother's apartment. Snow beginning to fall again softly outside the kitchen window, and Ellen listened with the same quiet pride she'd carried since the very first night her daughter came home, having lost everything for the sake of a stranger. "My father still talks about that loaf of bread," Sebastian said, smiling. "He calls it the best investment this family ever made." Amelia laughed, resting her head briefly against his shoulder, and told him it had never felt like an investment to her, only the only choice she could have made, and still recognized herself afterward. Winter returned to Denver as it always did, blanketing the city in the same quiet white it always used to cover over the sharp edges of a hard year. And Amelia found herself standing at her office window one December morning watching the first real snowfall settle over the plaza below. She thought about the version of herself who had walked home 11 blocks in soaked sneakers, certain her life had just fallen apart over a decision she never regretted, and she thought about how far a single choice, made without any expectation of reward, had somehow carried her here. Some good deeds are never repaid, she thought, watching the snow fall steady and unhurried outside the glass. But this one had been, in every way that mattered, and she would make the same choice again without hesitation. Down the hall, she could hear Sebastian's voice through the open door of his office, laughing at something Perry had said, and beyond that, faintly, the sound of the city going about its ordinary business under a sky that kept forgiving it without a sound, flake by flake, the way it always had. Somewhere across town, in an apartment that still smelled faintly of cornbread on Sunday afternoons, Ellen Doran kept a small framed photograph on the kitchen windowsill. Amelia in her old Northgate vest, standing beside an elderly man in a plain wool coat. Taken by a stranger on the day everything changed. She liked to tell visitors that the photograph wasn't there to remind her daughter how far she'd come, but to remind her where kindness had first taken root, without any expectation of snow ever turning into something warmer. If Amelia's story moved you even a little, let us know in the comments where you're watching from tonight, and stay close, because Wintervale has another story waiting for you very soon.